Hello, C3RF members and Canadians across the country. Welcome to another session of In Hot with Major Russ Cooper, retired. Recall that In Hot is a fighter pilot term, means we're rolling in on target, weapons armed and ready. And today's target is going to be the Notre-Dame-de-Grace-Westmount riding in election 2021. And our special guest and wingman is David Freiheit. Freiheit? Did I get that right?
Freiheit. Phonetically, it's Freiheit, and it's verbatim freedom in German.
Right. Okay, Freiheit. And we're rolling in on this target. He has thrown his hat in the ring as the People's Party of Canada candidate in the Westmount riding. And he's going up against one of the most powerful Liberal operatives in the country. He's going up against Marc Garneau. And I got to ask you right off the top, David, what motivated you to throw your hat in the ring against someone like Marc Garneau?
The funny thing is, I mean, there's no other way to answer it. I had no choice. I've spent the last 18 months watching what I thought to be a free and democratic Canada crumble at the foundations, get torn apart at the seams. What we had as a constitution effectively shredded into, recommendations or privileges that the government thinks they can give or take away willy-nilly as they see fit. And I had no choice. I guess I could have picked another riding, perhaps one that would be less competitive, more competitive, less dominated, for lack of a better word. Yeah. But I'm from Westmount. I'm born and raised. I lived briefly for a couple of years in NDG. This is my home. And if I'm not going to run where I was born and raised, it would feel a little awkward, a little weird, a little insincere to try to run in another riding just to have a better chance at succeeding. So I made the decision. I'll go in Westmount, Notre-Dame-de-Grace. People here know me. People here know my name. My dad's been a prominent litigator for 45 years. I've been I won't say prominent, but a litigator, known in the community. And so I think I have a decent chance regardless, but it's my home. So I'm going to start in my base before I try to, eke in another riding where I don't have any meaningful attachment to.
Well, I tell you, if, we're talking about being a tough race here, I'm hearing an awful lot of rumbles about you're doing very, very well. And this looks like it's going to be a real competitive race.
The thing is, and this, I say this not to be disrespectful or not to be by no means arrogant. If Marc Garneau is, the most prominent Liberal candidate, and he's among them. I mean, he's the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Right. He's a very, I'm sure he's a nice person on a personal level. I know his grandkids are friends, if by one degree of connection, to my kids. I have no problem with him as a person, but as a candidate, as a member of Parliament, and as a representative of the Liberal Party, I mean, if Marc Garneau is going to be the strongest candidate, well, I mean, there are problems within the party because Marc Garneau may be a solid individual. He nonetheless, his boss is nonetheless Justin Trudeau, the party itself, Trudeau with his ethics violations, with his overt corruption, mismanagement, incompetence. So, individually, Marc Garneau may be the nicest person on earth, but he is representing a party now that represents, I would say, everything that's wrong in politics and everything that's wrong in Canada.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see your strategy here in your run. And as a disclaimer, I myself must say that I know Marc Garneau. I went to school with him at Royal Military College. I played with him on the same varsity football team way back when he was at the college. He's a fine gentleman, a truly gifted leader, and he's gone on to do some things in his life that very, very few people can do.
Absolutely.
But we here at Canadian Citizens for Charter Rights and Freedoms, C3RF, that's our name. We're very, very concerned with the direction of the country when it comes to those fundamental individual rights that you're talking about that say motivated you to get into the race. And we can see some real problems since the onset of the Liberal government in 2015, where things like freedom of speech are just being hollowed out. It's just incredible how much they've been hollowed out over the course of the last 6 years.
It's an amazing thing because I was not living in a bubble. I was just not aware. And when I first started with my YouTube channel, because I was a litigator, I was plugging away day in and day out. And like most people, when you're plugging away day in and day out, only on a professional basis to make ends meet, you don't pay attention or you don't notice say, the broader political issues, the broader context of the country. And so I totally recognize now that I was effectively blind or totally unaware of what was going on when I started my YouTube channel, started breaking down legal issues. You know, freedom of speech came up. I had a large demographic that's from the United States. And whenever I talked about a lawsuit that dealt with freedom of speech or defamation in particular, the US contingency would say, you know, you guys up in Canada, you have no freedom of speech. You have no rights. I never understood what they were saying until the pandemic hit. And then I realized where the government was already at in its own mind come pandemic time, but it had been in the works, for at the very least a few years. And then you begin to appreciate the impact of some legislation, hate speech legislation, yes. Modifying the criminal code to add certain other aggravating factors. And then Jordan Peterson comes out and starts, you know, raising the flag about compelled speech. And then, like Kierkegaard said, life can only be lived forwards, but can only be understood backwards. I screwed it up. Life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. And so in hindsight now, this all, you know, the progression makes sense. And it reached a tipping point with me and my understanding come pandemic time, and come constitutional rights fall by the wayside. The courts, you know, I don't say things like corruption or what, as far as the courts go, but the courts are deferential to the government. The government is deferential to their medical appointees. And so you have this political and judicial ecosystem that is self-referential, circular of sorts, and all but disregarded what were constitutional charter rights. And we quickly discover that, you know, they've been chiseled away for a while. And so you've had chiseling away of freedom of speech, you've had chiseling away of, you know, internet rights, and then it all really came to a head with the pandemic. And now I think even the people who are plugging away day in and day out in their jobs are now starting to appreciate what on earth is going on when my mobility rights are being compromised, when my, you know, liberty of my own body, of my own being are being taken away from us. I think most people are starting to wake up and say, this liberal government, ironically, is quite illiberal.
Yeah, I've noticed with great surmise and astonishment the part that the courts have played in this whole pandemic affair. I've seen. You might be aware of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. They take these constitutional cases to court. In Edmonton, within the past half year or so, they petitioned to the courts to have the government show some evidence that you know, that these restrictions to our liberties are necessary and need to be put in place. And the court said no, we don't have to honor that. So the government wasn't required to provide any evidence.
Well, so I've done actually a few interviews with someone from the JCCF way back in the day. There was some internal drama there, which we don't need to discuss now. It's not relevant, but they've been doing great work in their lawsuits. And yeah, effectively, you know, people don't appreciate that when you file an injunction, interlocutory or provisional injunction, you don't get to the evidence on the merits just yet. It's always prima facie looking at the incomplete file as is and determining what is the best interim measure based on the criteria, balance of inconvenience, color of right, etc. So we haven't really gotten to any hearings on the merits, evidentiary hearings. No. But we've seen systematically in Quebec, the courts not strike down the curfew on the basis that it's not urgent enough, or the balance of inconvenience does not warrant in favor of striking down the curfew, even though our own health director, Horacio Arruda, said that there's no scientific evidence to show the effectiveness of a curfew to combat a virus out of his own mouth.
That's incredible.
Imposed. And then, you know, the quarantine hotels, which I have found to be possibly the most egregious violation of civil rights, constitutional rights I could imagine, being compelled to be detained in a government facility, call it a hotel, located in a hotel. If you're under federal detention, I don't care if it's in a hotel, it may as well be a prison, because that's effectively what it is. And the courts, on the interim basis, come to the conclusion that the prospective risks of not detaining an individual, even though they've received a negative test, can warrant that deprivation of rights and liberties. Look, I mean, the courts are, no judge wants to be the judge who's going to be responsible for an outbreak, which may or may not be connected to an event, but can be attributed to an event. So they all want to play it safe. They all want to not have any proverbial COVID on their hands at the expense of everything that made our country great and free. And now what? So what can you do? I have had this discussion with people online. What can we do without resorting to anything that you're not supposed to do? It has to be a political solution, because it's not going to be a judicial one, and it's not going to be the existing politicians who are going to change. It has to be, a clean slate, new house of politicians who say, yes, we may be going through something of a health emergency, but that does not justify anything and everything as relates to trampling civil rights and liberties.
That's what we've been saying, and that's what we've been saying at C3RF, is that we need a new slate of players here, because there are just too many vested interests, too many rice bowls in play, too much going on there for people to change the way they're doing business. So we need a fresh slate of candidates. That's why it's so pleasant to see chaps like yourself.
I don't want to, I don't want to use the analogy Dumb and Dumber, but basically you have constitutional rights violators and constitutional rights violators light version, which is the conservatives. It's shocking to me that nobody has come in and said, this is unjustifiable, even in the situation of an emergency. You cannot lock people in their houses from 8 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning under any circumstances, except the most extreme, where people probably wouldn't want to go out anyhow. And, instead of having the federal government intervene for charter violations on the provincial level, now they want to subsidize it. And they want to come out, and you have Trudeau saying $1 billion for a COVID vaccine passport app fund. Yes. Instead of fighting it, subsidizing it. And then you get the likes of Doug Ford jumping on the bandwagon saying, well, I want my fair share. I want my dibs of that $1 billion, taxpayer dollars. And so it's just institutionalized. I use the word corruption at this level because it is politicians buying off the provinces. It's the Liberal government basically buying off, at the one hand, the media started first with bailouts and massive subsidies, and you effectively turn whatever was an independent media into a mouthpiece for the government. And now it's infiltrated at the provincial level. Here's $1 billion, guys. If you want to make a vaccine passport app, how it could cost $1 billion, I don't know. I think there's a lot of money to be sifted off the top there for any government that does it.
Oh, but must be an awful lot of administration going on there, I'll tell you. But it was only last week that Premier Ford was saying that he'd have nothing to do with vaccine passports. And now $1 billion has popped up, and we're going to do it, and it's going to happen like next week.
It was only 6 months ago that Justin Trudeau himself said, what about people with medical conditions? What about people with deep religious convictions who don't want to take the vaccine passport? We are not a country that makes mandatory vaccination. 6 months later, his new ad, I believe in mandatory vaccination for travel and planes. I say that they're principleless politicians, but they're worse than that, because it's not just that they're hypocrites and have, if they didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all. It's that they're divisive and fundamentally, dangerous in their rhetoric. When you have the Prime Minister of Canada coming out and saying, you're free not to get vaccinated, but don't think you can get on a train or a plane and put someone who's vaccinated at risk, other than being divisive and dangerous, and some might even call it dog whistle in terms of rhetoric, it's scientifically incorrect to say that. And
I think he said there will be consequences.
He said two things. He said there will be consequences as relates to federal employees who don't want to get the vaccination after being, now become mandatory. But he said in one of his stump speeches, I forget for whom he was speaking, he says verbatim, and I've been posting it on Twitter so people remember this. If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's okay. That's your choice. And then he gets passionate. But don't think you can get on a plane or a train and put the unvaccinated at risk. I mean, this is next level demonizing, scapegoating, and pitting a majority of the population that is already vaccinated against a minority, and unnecessarily so, because on the one hand, you're not going to convince the unvaccinated, and you're not going to convince those who have medical or religious reasons for which they don't want to do it. And you're not actually going to make friends with the people who are vaccinated and say, you might have gone a little too far with this one, Trudeau. You might be sounding a little too, I don't know if demagogic is the word, but you might be sounding a little dangerous, even for those of us who are vaccinated. And full disclosure, I'm double vaccinated. I will not download the app. I will not go into stores that require this as a precondition. Look, I'm a bit of a loser anyhow. I got 3 kids and I don't do much, so I don't need to do these things. It's not going to hurt me as much as it's going to hurt a 25-year-old, but I won't do it. But there are people that
incredible. What I find incredible, David, is that we've been saying at C3RF for some time now that the ballot box question is going to be our individual rights and freedoms, because of the way things are shaking out in Canada, and because we're basically becoming a police state, and rapidly. But it surprises me. Well, maybe I'm not surprised, but I'm really nonplussed by the fact that all of the legacy parties are going out of the way to say that the ballot box question is climate change, is childcare, is maybe the Conservatives will talk a bit about the economy, but we can sort the debt out within 10 years' time, balance the budget. There seems to none of the legacy parties want to talk about this, and everyone's surprised now that Trudeau has a band of followers that go that follow him from place to place with signs that say they don't like him that much.
Well, you know what? I don't think it's a band of followers following him. I think it's everywhere he goes, he's now seeing grassroots level opposition and outright contempt for what he's doing to Canada.
Yes,
because this is not a fringe. First of all, I'll just preface this by saying I don't speak the way I don't say swear words. I think more effective than saying, F you, Trudeau, is to actually be poignant and say that you are an absolute divisive hypocrite who is tearing Canada apart. I would go about it with the more eloquent way. But what people are doing out there, it might not be the way I would express myself, but it is the necessary. First of all, you have to put up with it because you're a politician, you're a public figure, and you're doing things to a country that are going to elicit this reaction. And you need to know that people do not support what you're doing. To the extent it remains peaceful and swear words, I do not consider them to be violence. No. Then I will always support people's right to speak. Being on YouTube, I don't block people when they call me names. That's just the nature of the beast. So you have to deal with it. But I don't think these are followers, following him around. These are people everywhere he goes. And I've been saying it on Twitter. It's telling that he can only get his speeches out either in the privacy of his own bus or in the seclusion of his own areas, because he's seeing it now. And we are all seeing it. People on the street, regular citizens, are not putting up with this nonsense anymore. No. And he should be getting a feel for the land. The only problem is, you get the Conservatives, who are supposed to be an opposition party, who themselves are now saying anyone who protested is out of the party. Anybody who is anti-vaccine passport, the Yukon candidate, is out of the party. I mean, yes. This is I'll say this because it's a great spin. But people say, why should I vote PPC? Because I'm just going to split the Conservative vote. And my response is, you're not splitting the Conservative vote. The Conservatives now are splitting the Liberal vote, because there is very little difference between the Liberals and the Conservative, except for the Liberals' proven track record of lack of ethics and corruption. And that's probably only because Erin O'Toole has not had the benefit of being in power for 6 years. There's nothing that divides the two parties right now. And the people who are voting PPC, they're not just Conservatives, and I can tell you this, they are Liberals as well. They're Liberals as well who realize that the PPC is actually more liberal, more pro-choice, more pro-rights than the Liberal Party itself. And people are seeing this. And what we see on the streets right now is a swell from the bottom of people who are just vehemently opposed to what they see Justin Trudeau doing to our country in real time.
Swell from the bottom. I think that is so on point. I'm myself, I'm a former military pilot, and I also flew for Air Canada. And I know many pilots who are looking at this new federal legislation that's coming out, saying that federally regulated employees will be mandated to have a vaccine, and that, of course, includes the transportation sector and my buddies who are still working back at the airline. And I can tell you, they're not everyone is happy about this. This is, and we're also seeing in police services. I have a friend. His name is Julius Rochelle. He was in hot wingman a couple of weeks ago, and he's a very clear thinker, and he's got an essay out. Actually, he published a letter from a Toronto Police Service constable. Her name is Adrian. And if I could, I just want to cut away to that letter and just talk to it about with you, because I think it really speaks to what you're talking about, a groundswell. So if I can I share screen here?
You tell me. I share it. If I am not in a position to comment, I will not be too arrogant to admit that. So I haven't read the letter, so let's see what it says. And if you know how to screen share, there you go.
Okay. Now that's actually
that's me.
That's you.
I know that guy.
That's August 13. I thought I'd throw that picture up there to show everybody what you look like from the neck down.
Yeah, and you know what? I subsequently shaved, so I'm a little bit lighter on the facial hair now. I like it better with the beard.
You do a lot of your videos. It's the Viva Freiheit
Yeah,
videos?
no, well, Viva Fry, it's just the sort of
Viva Fry.
live-free derivative of, yeah, my
You're in
last
your
name.
car. You're in your car, away from the wife, I guess, getting out
It
of her
started
hair.
off, well, no, it started off as the COVID, I call it a gag, but in the reality, in the beginning part of COVID, I couldn't shoot my videos in the house anymore because there were kids, everyone was on lockdown. So the quietest place was in the car. But then I discovered the acoustics are actually much better in the car. So it became a gag, and it's become
Okay.
sort of my identifiable defining feature.
Okay, I was going to put this little your little spiel on from August 13 on for about a minute or so, but I think we've already seen your how you present yourself and communicate. So I'm going to go right to Julius's letter, and here, can you see that?
I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, and he's got and he calls it an example of courageous pushback for those facing vaccine mandates in the workplace. And he goes on to give credit to Constable Adrian Gilvesi from the Toronto Police Service for pushing back against her chief of police. He says, "I'm not going to take the vaccine, and I'm not going to be tested." And she lays out her reasoning very clearly, and she's done a lot of research here, and she talks about privacy laws. She talks about medical health choices being confidential. She talks about the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act of 1990. She goes on to informed consent, and she gives the parameters for informed consent. And she's saying that, I'm not getting a chance to have to give my informed consent because I'm not getting the information.
Well, and
then,
not just that, it's not consent if it's obtained through coercion or extortion. I mean, telling someone, here's all the information, and now you have to say yes, otherwise you lose your job. You may have all the information, but it's not consent. It's not enlightened consent if it's extorted through the threat of, deprivation of civil rights or loss of a job.
And that's what she says. She says the consent must be informed, voluntary, and it can't be obtained through misrepresentation or fraud or coercion, as you have stated. So she's very, very lucid, and she goes back into history here. She talks about the Nuremberg Code, and the Nuremberg Code that comes out 1947 after the Nazi atrocities in World War II, and they come out. And the Nuremberg Code came out. Canada's a signatory to it, about not forcing people to undergo medical experiments without their voluntary consent, informed consent.
And I know the pushback, the counter arguments to this, people, nobody likes making analogies to World War II, the Holocaust. The standard and the predictable response is that this is not an experiment anymore. Nobody's forcing you to experiment because they've already done the experiments. That's why it got the emergency authorization use and now some form of FDA approval. So it's not experimentation. It's been proven. Now you just have to take it. It's arguable as to whether or not that's what was meant by the Nuremberg Code in terms of forcing people to take a new medication. The only issue is up until now, it was still referred to, and I think still is referred to, as an experimental vaccine by the National Institute of Health. That's I don't think that has changed under whatever FDA approval the Pfizer vaccine just got. So there's an analogy, there's an argument to be made there, understanding what people who want to distinguish are going to say. But the idea that people can be compelled now to take this under these particular set of circumstances, because we're not talking about polio, we're not talking about measles, either in terms of the lethality of the disease or proven track record of the vaccine. We're talking about COVID-19, this EAU vaccine, which has barely been around for 2 years, not even 2 years, a year, which is based on relatively new technology, the mRNA technology that has not been widely tested in humans, let alone kids. And now we're talking about compulsion to either take the vaccine or disclose why you don't want to take the vaccine, which I'm open about my medical stuff. I had shingles actually February before the pandemic hit. And I did read, this is not medical advice, and this is not, I did read that one of the risks of any vaccine, but also the COVID, I think it was the Pfizer vaccine, is that it can trigger a relapse of shingles. And my case of shingles was pretty serious. If I say so myself, I still have what they call post-herpetic neuralgia, which is numbness and itching all over the section where I had it on my body. I was like, I didn't really want to take my chances with that. I'd prefer almost to get COVID than get that, what I experienced with shingles. But imagine someone who doesn't want to disclose that that's why they're not getting the vaccine,
Yes.
or other reasons. And you're forcing, like, it's now, we've created a world where everyone thinks they're entitled to know intimate medical information, intimate religious information about individuals for this particular virus, which has its survival rate among the demographics. It's just we've basically, I say, nationalized private information, and we've basically now everyone has turned into what's that movie where the Secret Lives of Others? Everyone's just basically turned into a society where they think they're entitled to this intimate information from everyone else so that they can feel safe, even if they've been vaccinated, by knowing someone else has been vaccinated. And that's not how any society should work, in my humble opinion. But sorry, I tried that.
Incredible. And I'm seeing, we talk about vaccination and vaccination passports. We're talking about documents that the goalposts can be moved on. As a matter of fact, I just read this morning where in Israel, they're finding that the vaccines are failing. They're not, they don't have the efficacy over a long time period, more than say 4-6 months. So what they're saying now is they have the Green Pass system in Israel. And what they're saying now, your Green Pass is no longer valid unless you get a booster.
And people, I was telling, oh, by the way, am I still visible on your screen?
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay, awesome. I was having this discussion, so I was going door to door, having the door not slammed in my face, but having the pen returned to me with a point when I said I was running for the People's Party of Canada. And I ran into 3 elderly ladies who were walking their dogs in the neighborhood. So we sort of, if we don't know each other, but we've seen each other before. And they said, you know what, well, why should I be against the vaccine passport? And I said, well, first of all, someone else getting vaccinated should not impact, if the vaccine is effective, it should not impact you who's been vaccinated, in theory. And we now know that even the vaccinated can transmit and suffer, the illness. So there's that. But then I said, you may think right now that you're safe and you're all good. And when you get kicked out of or you get denied entry to a restaurant because you didn't know that now it requires a booster and maybe a second booster, maybe annual boosters, then you might start getting a little bit frustrated. On the one hand, well, what do I have to, my body is now like an entity of the state where in order for me to live freely, I have to be, yes. even if it's totally safe, I have to be subjected to these boosters in order to gain entry. But even you'll see the inconvenience when I didn't know the goalposts have moved and now I'm being denied services in my own country. Then you might get frustrated. Then you might start to say, yeah, maybe the vaccine passport was a bad idea. Or when your grandkids are denied entry and you see the look of dismay and disgust on their faces as to what country we're living in right now, where a 13-year-old will be denied access to a gym, a cafe, a movie because they're not double vaccinated with the booster, whatever it is. I mean, then maybe the grandparents are going to start getting a little bit angry at what we've created in terms of.
I'm a grandparent and I'm getting a little bit irritated. I'll tell you that, because when they talk about giving the vaccine to people, kids 12 to 17, I'm thinking, why are we doing this? Because all the data is pretty, all the empirical data is out there saying that these kids don't really suffer, and the survival rate is hugely in the positive side. It's
effectively I don't want to say anything that can be misquoted. The long-term risk and fatality among anyone under 18 is infinitesimally small. And now they're saying the Delta variant is affecting kids more. We are forgetting that this is a coronavirus, and coronaviruses have existed before COVID, and that effectively you cannot eradicate a virus. Yeah. Most people, the consensus is that natural immunity is better than manufactured immunity. But as far as it goes for children, 18 and under, we had 2 deaths in all of Quebec in 2 years, and we don't know what the underlying issues were on those 2 particular astronomically rare cases. And now you want to vaccinate all the children. And at first, we'll talk about, moving goalposts. At first, it was vaccinate the kids to protect the adults. And when that argument started to lose, what's the word? What's the word I'm looking for? When it stopped being convincing, because people were rightly retorting, you don't experiment on kids. You don't throw kids in the front lines to protect the adults. Typically, it's the exact other way around. Well, now they've shifted the argument to Delta variant is affecting kids, so we're doing it to protect the kids now, even though the risks are infinitesimally small to justify compelled vaccination, let alone vaccination in general. And the unknowns in terms of playing with a developing young person's immune system. We just don't know the unknown. So the question is the prospective benefit at all outweighed by the potential unknowns? And at that point, you have to say, like, okay, well, you know,
that's all part of, sorry, Dave, that's all part of informed consent, is knowing the risks versus the benefits. In the case of kids, we're seeing a definite shift toward the benefit side of not having the vaccine.
And it's almost heretical to say, it's almost, you become a heretic to say this, but
yes,
we've seen heart inflammation in young boys and young men.
Yes.
We've seen a number of issues which, everyone says, well, they heal and, you know, they left the hospital, but so did they virtually almost all the time with COVID itself. If not all the time, you know, they some are hospitalized. My kid's been hospitalized for the flu during an ordinary flu season. I mean, things happen. There are anomalies, but you do not make the rules out of the exceptions, except, you know, when you're a politician, that's exactly what you do. I'm doing it for the protection of the kids, Justin Trudeau says, when the risks are infinitesimally small. And there have been, I won't quantify it, but there have been known issues, known risks and known hospitalizations as a result of the vaccine in the young kids. And so the question is, what are you doing? What are you doing? And why are you doing it? And what is the end game? I mean, it doesn't stop it here, for sure.
There's a lot of missing information here. They tell us that that Delta is bad for kids. Well, where's the peer-reviewed reports? Where's the research? They never give you the research.
It hasn't been around
some
long
data
enough.
Suggests.
No, and it hasn't been around long enough for them to make that affirmation. And whether or not it's bad for kids, the ordinary flu, and we know it because the stats said it, and we've had the stats now, not the Delta variant, but COVID itself. The ordinary flu lands more kids in the hospital than COVID itself.
Yes.
And now what do we do? So now we're coming out with the Delta variant and using that as the excuse. It is, to me, it's actually just unconscionable that we could even think of imposing this. If parents want to do it, those are parental rights, you know, to the extent it's not proven, you know, overtly dangerous. Parents can vaccinate their kids and so on. But to compel it and then to turn adolescenthood is already difficult enough for kids. And I was there and I remember, I mean, I bounced around 3 high schools in 5 years. I remember what adolescenthood was like in normal times. Mm-hmm. To now create a society where kids are feeling shamed or pressured by their friends or by society, or they're made to feel like second-class teenagers, or they're denied entry because their parents have moral or religious or medical reasons for which they don't want to do this, and you ostracize these kids. I mean, it is just unconscionable. There's no other way to describe it, and it's a society that's gone mad, but it's being led by the politicians, and I would say confirmed by the media. But it's yes. a society just gone mad.
Yeah, the media is certainly playing a big part in this whole thing, and we're seeing. When you talk about the media, there are always two sides to every story, and we are just not seeing the other side. Like how much damage is actually being done by ostracizing kids, by giving them a vaccine, by economic damage. Small businesses lose their means of putting food on the table. Why has no one tried to quantify that kind of damage versus the damage of not being vaccinated?
Well, I'll give you the first reason. This is the foundation of all of it. When the media is subsidized in the order of $1.6 billion to the government, it's a struggling industry ordinarily. You have the CBC, which is subsidized to the tune of $1 billion a year. The rest of the mainstream media, $600 million a year, even more now if you factor in these COVID ads. In Quebec, $150 million a year for COVID awareness ads. That is, some people call it, well, that's awareness. Setting aside whether or not during a bona fide, a pandemic, you need to have ads to remind people, that is effectively buying off the media by getting them conditioned to that government money to help them stay afloat, to the point where they don't run messaging that runs afoul of the government messaging, because the government can pull those ads like they tried to do with Radio X in Quebec City, pull the ads if they don't like the messaging of the media, in order to compel them to submit to less critical analysis. So we have no critical analysis from the media, and it's just the natural result of the corruption, the incestuous relationship that occurs when the government funds the media, who's supposed to be reporting on the government. Don't expect the media to bite the hand that feeds them. But we're not hearing the other side.
Not at all. not at all.
Not, but it's also, it doesn't play into the narrative. I mean, first, it doesn't play into how media works. Media operates by fear. We call it fear porn in the industry, but fear clicks get more clicks than rational discourse.
Blood
Sorry,
leads
go ahead.
blood leads the in the headlines type thing.
No, yeah, that's it. And it's a more complicated, nuanced debate. It's a lot easier to pick the infinitesimally rare example of the story of the guy who didn't get vaccinated and then died, as opposed to the other stories that they could run with. And
yep.
The interesting thing is, just like when you talk about motivated reasoning and how people will shift their logic, shift their reasoning in order to fit the ends that they want to get to. When anybody dies of a decision made to vaccination or not, COVID or not, if the death is in any way related, it'll be attributed. But then when it comes to adverse effects from the vaccine, the media goes out of its way to say, well, we don't know. There's nothing. They want to downplay one and oversell the other, and it's the effect of a media that is no longer independent or free, but beholden to the government that is subsidizing them.
There seems to be an awful lot of these slanted narratives coming out of the media, out of our politicians, out of our leaders, and we're talking about PCR tests on that letter that I showed you from the young constable. She goes on to talk about PCR tests and how they're not reliable, and they're being used for a purpose that they were not designed for, and they're not applicable to determining whether or not a person is infectious. And she goes on to state, and this has been proven, that they cycle these tests at such a high rate that what they're picking up and calling positive is they could be dead viruses, nucleotides that are no threat at all.
And I've read the same thing. This is where I know the limitations of my own understanding in order to not make positive affirmations. I've read the same reports. I read that the WHO changed the criteria for PCR testing, and I've read that PCR testing yields, apparently, according to some, very high false positive rates.
Yes.
But setting all of that aside, we know of the stats enough now to know what they are, to know who's at risk, who's vulnerable, and who's not. And we are also starting to see very quickly that natural immunity is better and longer lasting than whatever immunity the vaccines create. And so instead of implementing policy that reflects that reality, that statistical reality that we now have almost 2 years of data to confirm, it's just full-blown panic mode, where we think that in order to combat the virus and protect the elderly, who are the ones dying in old person's homes, we got to prevent a 13-year-old from getting on a train if they're not double vaccinated. It's Parkinson's law at the political level, is that the government, I don't want to say that they're stupid, they might be incompetent. And what typically happens, Parkinson's law of mundanity. Economist who had a great principle that a boardroom of people will argue over where to place the water cooler for longer than they will about how to maximize shareholder value, because one is easier to understand and one is easier to resolve. So instead of protecting the old people at the old person's homes, where they've been dying, I think they constitute roughly 80% of the deaths. No, it's easier to ban kids from trains and planes. I mean, it's easier to create a vaccine passport and donate $1 billion of our taxpayer funds to subsidize that, as opposed to actually solving the problem, which might also reveal a little bit of government incompetence and potentially even a bit of government corruption. Because when we appreciate that the vast majority of the fatalities occurred in long-term healthcare facilities, and that they were ill-equipped and understaffed, partially because before this pandemic hit in February 2020, Trudeau donated 16 tons of PPE to China, knowing what was coming, but none of us did, and then leaves our LTHCs high and dry, where they had exponentially more deaths that were probably aggravated by lack of personnel and lack of PPE. And then when you understand that 1 in 3 people who died in the long-term healthcare facilities didn't die from COVID, but died apparently from neglect, malnourishment, and dehydration. And this is according to the military report itself of a few of the facilities. Well, then you begin to realize that maybe the government's reaction has been fractally wrong, in that everything they've done has actually exacerbated the problem as opposed to resolved it or protected those who are vulnerable. And very important thing also to understand, the government, when they said, well, how many people are dying in the facilities, long-term healthcare, not from COVID? And the response was, we don't know because we're not counting those. We're only counting the COVID deaths because that's all that we care about in order to determine our response to this. Well, when you're only counting one number, you're not only not getting a full view of the situation, you're getting a grossly distorted view, which leads to grossly distorted decisions. And another thing I say it because people don't appreciate it. The lockdowns in Quebec have undoubtedly killed more young kids than COVID itself. Because we know even by the media, maybe 2 kids under 18 or under 20 died in Quebec from COVID. Kids are dying from overdoses, from suicide, which some argue are not increased, but suicide, there's a lag in terms of the suicide rates going up. But overdoses, accidental, I factor that in to the necessary result of creating this environment for developing kids, young people. The measures have killed more people, young people, than COVID itself. And government doesn't stop for a second to ask themselves, maybe we should reassess.
Yeah. And again, that information just doesn't seem to be coming out. It seems like we're on a train headed down a track, and the track takes us to one place. Everybody vaccinated, 100%, passports, social media credit scores, perhaps.
Someone
it seems to be the place where we're going.
Because there is no meaningful opposition to even have this discussion. O'Toole and the Conservatives are not meaningful opposition. The Bloc, for all their foibles, historically, at the very least, they were meaningful opposition, but now they're not even meaningful opposition because the government has tasted this power. They like it, and they don't have any intention of relinquishing it because it gives them a reason to exist, and a reason to exist at levels that they have never hitherto I love such a long word, that they've never existed at. And and someone made a very astute observation as relates to the $1 billion vaccine passport fund. When you invest $1 billion in something, do you think it's going to go away after the alleged objective has been met? No. That $1 billion investment is going to be as integral and fundamental a part of Canadian society going forward as income tax.
It'll become structural and baked into budgets from here on in.
I genuinely think more people are beginning to realize this, that, at the beginning, I compared it to China, but I have a high school buddy who lives in China, and he says, dude, don't compare this to China because I live in China. We're not even doing here what you're doing in Canada.
Oh my God.
It's just like, okay, it's great. We're going to flatten the curve. We're going to flatten Canada. And when the goalposts keep moving,
flatten the curve. Yeah.
It's because we're, the government is a make work project.
Well, you talk about power and the accrual of power. A couple of examples over the course of the last year and a bit, we see a government that has suspended Parliament, instituted new policies where you only have 32 MPs in Parliament because of the COVID crisis. So basically, everybody who doesn't have a representative in the Parliament as one of the 32 is basically not represented anymore. We have a government that prorogued Parliament when it got into a little bit of hot water over this we thing.
People, I've done a playlist on the Trudeau corruption. People don't understand this, that the Aga Khan ethics violation, the SNC Lavalin ethics violation scandals, the We Charity didn't result in an ethics violation, which I think is an outrage. Dion, for whatever the reason, didn't do his job that time. I mean, then proroguing Parliament to suspend the inquiries into the We Charity scandal, corruption through and through. But I mean, Russ, can you imagine this? I don't know what, I don't know your military history, but we had men like you, people, I mean, men and women, it wasn't a gender thing, but you have men and women who fought in wars, literally life and death. And now we're seeing the government saying, we don't want to hold an election because this virus with 99 point whatever, however much you want to quantify it, 99 plus survival rate is such a risk that we as young, what should be able-bodied, fit individuals, members of Parliament, are not willing to assume this risk to do our jobs, that the society where, we in Baghdad, we implored citizens to go vote and fend off suicide bombings and violence at the voting booths. And here we're saying, but we don't want to, it's too risky for us to go to I'm going to lose my words because you cannot but think that these politicians are doing this for reasons other than the genuine protection of the people, because I don't even think the population itself, if they hadn't been whipped into this frenzy by 2 years of media-induced fear porn, would even think like this. But
Yes.
I've seen the transition in a lot of people. It's amazing what a year and a half of day in, day out
People are so
fear-mongering
afraid.
can do.
People are so afraid and angry that they react very negatively if you're not following the narrative and keeping in step with it. But for my own part, I was in the military. I had the honor of serving in combat. I was deputy commander of the F-18 squadron that was in the first Persian Gulf War when we went against Saddam Hussein and his Republican Guard. And I can tell you quite frankly that, and this is maybe why I wound up with C3RF the way I have, is that when we went over there to project Canadian values and freedoms and to boot tyranny out of Kuwait, I never thought I would see a day when my own country, Canada, would start putting quarantine camps in place, having police arrest people, having police arrest pastors for having a church service and throwing them in the back of a car so they can go off to 21 days of isolated internment in a jail. This is not the Canada that I put my life on the line for, and I know my buddies didn't do it for that reason either. So
I'm going to cut this clip and post this everywhere, because this is what people need to hear and people need to understand. I've never fought, I've never served. I've just been sitting here watching it happen in real time, saying it doesn't make sense. People don't appreciate what they're giving up. When I had a meet and greet in the park over the weekend, there were only maybe 30 some odd people there, but at the very least a quarter were from countries that traditionally were and are deemed to be totalitarian regimes. Eastern Europe, South America, Iran. And they're saying, we see it. We understand what's going on right now. We recognize the patterns. We recognize the transition, but people in Canada have never lived through it. They don't know what they're looking for to even identify it in the first place. And I've got to say, at the beginning, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, okay, I was game. Turned into
Same
2
here.
months,
Same here.
okay, I'll make the sacrifice. I made a good time of it with my family. Then it turned into social distancing. And I was like, okay, this is getting Orwellian spooky. Then it turns into not having people in your home. Then it turns into celebrating Christmas differently. Then it turns into curfew. Then it turns into mask mandates. Then it turns into compelled vaccination, and now vaccine passports. And it's the boiling frog analogy. But for anybody who has fought for our freedom, who's put their life on the line in the actual meaningful sense of bullets flying overhead, looking at this and saying Parliament and all our members of Parliament voting virtually unanimously, it's a symbolic vote, not to hold the election because it's too dangerous. Well, they have no concept of true danger. They have no concept of true heroism.
I don't think they have a concept of what of how valuable freedom actually is, and how it needs to be defended, needs to be fought for. Otherwise, you have people come in and just scoop it away, take it away.
No, and Reagan said it. It's for all of his purported senility and lack of intelligence. He said some of the most insightful things on earth, and one of which was, we are never more than one generation away from total loss of freedom. And when the government gets it, when the government invests $1 billion in a vaccine passport app fund, and when they invest in all these policies, it becomes status quo for the government, and then good luck getting that back. Good luck getting it back.
Yeah, just as an aside, we talk about $1 billion for a vaccine passport app implementation in the provinces. I read this morning as well that they're coming out with a $5 million grant to develop internment camps, voluntary internment camps in Ontario, 4 of them, Belleville, Cochrane, Hamilton, and Kenora. And so we're starting to build voluntary internment camps, and talking about the way these goalposts are being moved. I just wonder how far down the road they are no longer voluntary, but they become something else.
Vaccination, I haven't read that story, so I can't comment on that. I know what they're doing in New Zealand, or what I've seen that they're doing in New Zealand. Yes. Mm-hmm. But the vaccine was voluntary at one point as well. Masks were voluntary at one point as well. I've always said from the beginning, under the Quarantine Act, you don't need to build new camps for quarantine. You can just designate facilities as quarantine facilities. And they did it. I mean, that's what they did when they converted hotels into government designated quarantine facilities. But it's all of this in an attempt to probably do the impossible, which is eradicate a virus, as opposed to mitigate the effects of the virus, because at the end of the day, you probably can't eradicate a virus, nor will you probably be able to develop a vaccine for a coronavirus, because it's not going to be any different for this vaccine, for this coronavirus, than it has been for any previous coronavirus. So instead of doing what the government was supposed to do from the beginning, flatten the curve to not overwhelm the healthcare facilities, and then figure out a sustainable, long-lasting solution for that, they've just gone into grabbing up rights because they can't address their own fundamental problems, because it probably will reveal their incompetence and potentially corruption, because we spend a lot of money on the healthcare system. It doesn't make sense why.
Sorry, it's becoming so blatant that it's becoming obvious, seemingly obvious that there's something sinister behind this whole grab of power.
Sinister or incompetent, the result is the same. The result is the same, is that the government is not fixing the underlying problem. It enrages me to hear Justin Trudeau come out now and talk about strengthening the healthcare system, getting our seniors. He literally made decisions that exacerbated the deaths of seniors, and in the last 2 years has done diddly squat to actually make the situation better. And François Legault, same criticism. $150 million in COVID awareness ads, while they are literally asking the healthcare system in Quebec to cut $150 million from their budget. I mean, it's not hard. We know we have a shortage of staff in the hospitals. We know that we have a brain drain. And what do? Instead of incentivizing people to join the healthcare system, they disincentivize them by firing them at the federal level if they don't get vaccinated, and implementing these policies which are going to deter people from working in and cause people to leave.
We talked about Toronto Police Services having a problem, but the nurses are having the same kind of problem with nurses walking.
And I had, I was in a hospital, not for anything serious, just the other day, and I was asking one of the doctors, like, we know the demographics as well as to who are reluctant or not getting vaccinated at the same level as others. In the States, it's even more pronounced. Something like a quarter of the Black population have been fully vaccinated, as opposed to 70 some odd % of the white population. Mm-hmm. It's roughly the same here. We just don't have the same numbers, but we know who we are actually penalizing in a very meaningful sense by implementing these draconian and totally unjustified measures. But as far as the healthcare system goes, instead of incentivizing people to join, we're actually causing them to leave, and we already have shortages. And it's fractal wrongness. Everything the government is doing is making the problem worse, but it gives them more power, and it gives them something to do, and it gives them something to spend our hard-earned tax dollars on. And they pretend that they're spending their money, not ours.
A lot of extra dollars when you talk about almost 400 billion in deficit. The net deficit is just over 1 year. It's not the debt. It's a $400 billion deficit in 1 year. So we have this other example. I recall it around budget time last December. The provinces were, you talk about flatten the curve. Okay, we're gonna bolster our medical system. We're going to get it beefed up so it can handle the surge. Last budget cycle, the provinces were screaming for money. They wanted 25 billion from the federal budget so that to help them bolster the medical system, and the federal government said no, and they turned around and gave, I think, 15 billion to foreign countries to help them with. It is
we have. I've said it before. I'll say it again. We have a prime minister who seems to be more focused on his international reputation and the clout that he gets when he goes to these international, G7, Davos conferences, whatever. He's more interested with his international reputation than he is with protecting Canadian citizens. And and then you have someone like Maxime Bernier come in who says, we're gonna limit immigration. We're gonna take care of Canadians. We're gonna get clean water to the Indigenous populations before we're gonna talk about taking tens of thousands of refugees in from war-torn countries. We appreciate the world is an ugly place, but it's the role of a prime minister to take care not only of their citizens, of their residents, of their own country, before compromising the well-being of their own people, their own populace, to the international community. And it might be a laudable thing. If you want to represent the international community, go do that at an international organization. But the Parliament of Canada is there for the Canadians. And there's nothing racist, xenophobic, or intolerant about saying, we're going to get our stuff under control. We're going to actually take care of our own population before giving away the money and the assets that we need for Canadians to the international community. There's a certain amount of international collaboration, cooperation for issues, but at the end of the day, our prime minister does not seem to care about Canadians and cares more about the clout that he gets on the international scene.
You know, he
And
seems
his
to be,
actions have proven it.
he seems to want to hitch his wagon up to these globalist initiatives like climate change and global migration. I guess the best way to put it is the United Nations Agenda 2030 sustainability development goals.
And it's a risky thing when anyone uses terms like globalist or the World Economic Forum or things like that. It turns people off who are not aware of it, and so they're like, oh, I don't know what globalist. If you're talking globalism, you must be one of those New World Order conspiracy theorists. Yeah. Well, let's just we'll oversimplify it or turn the terminology so that it doesn't offend those who are not aware of this. But the international community, Paris Accord, these international organizations which exist for whatever reasons, and they're good, they may have good reasons, they may have good reasons, but implement them badly. But when you're talking about crippling the Canadian economy for the greater good, the greater international good, whereas those who are actually causing the problems are doing nothing to actually resolve their own contributions to those problems, it's a virtue signaling sacrifice that will make Justin Trudeau feel good and look good on the international scale, because he will have decimated the Canadian economy when the Canadian economy represents a fraction of any meaningful global pollution. And all that he's ultimately ended up doing is outsourcing the pollution to the biggest contributors of the pollution, China and India. But it is, so I try not to use the word globalism because it will turn people off, but there's an international community that Justin Trudeau thinks is worthy of sacrifice of all that is Canada for the benefit of the international community. And it's a reckless and irresponsible way of being the leader of a country. There's a time and a place for that. Prime Minister of Canada is not that time or that place.
I think it'd be put even in more simple terms by saying that our political representatives, our leaders, are there because we voted them in. They're not there because they have a duty to the world at large, to the common good, to whatever other initiative that is or narrative that is being floated around. They are there for us, and we're the ones that put them in power.
100%. And they're basically, I won't say they're accepting policy, but they're basically being policy influenced by unelected officials who don't represent the people that put them into power. And there is no reason why unelected officials should be dictating or recommending policy to nations. There's no reason whatsoever. Sinister or negligent, or maybe they think they're doing the right thing. The end result is the same. It's not selfish to say we're going to make sure that our Indigenous populations are not experiencing violence at exponentially high rates, that they have clean drinking water, that the homeless, the overdoses among kids are taken care of, that Canadians have jobs so they can fend for themselves to stave off this spike in violence that we're seeing in real time. It's not selfish to say that. It's responsible to say that.
Here's a new development you might find of interest in Ontario again. Just within the past week, Ontario has altered the Reopening Act to allow medical officers the authority to establish at the regional level emergency measures as they deem fit. So you talk about bureaucrats or healthcrats being in charge of the direction of where we're going with these things, and we see that a premier, a provincial government, has handed over authority for such critical matters as emergency measures to regional medical officers, and the medical officers have started talking about how they're going to coordinate with each other to have max benefit when it comes to the new measures that they're thinking about. This is incredible.
There's a principle in law, I'm going to screw it up, it's a Latin term. It says delegatum non potest delegar. Who has been delegated cannot subdelegate the job. Which we're seeing not just subdelegation, but we're seeing subdelegation based on policy that has never gone through any legislative process.
Oh boy.
We have been ruled by government fiat, not executive orders in Canada, but fiat for the last year and a half. Nothing has gone through any meaningful legislative process. It's all been issued under the health orders or the public emergency acts, whatever you want to call them in your province.
At the provincial level, yeah.
And I've had these discussions where At first it was trying to convince someone that we actually live in a police state, because when you have the police circulating at 8 o'clock and, pepper spraying you for holding a New Year's Eve party, it's a police state. If you don't think it is, then we just don't agree on the definition, but it is.
Yeah.
Now I'm trying to convince people that we no longer live in a democracy, because you have these governments, provincial governments, implementing these health orders that by fiat, by executive order, without going through any legislative process, under the Emergency Act, where I've been saying this from the beginning, when the emergency lasts for more than 30 days, it's the government that's the problem and not the emergency, because the reason why these emergency measures existed in the first place was government cannot convene given the emergency. A dam broke, a hurricane touched down, we don't have time to meet, let's put in some temporary orders, and then we go pass things by law. The government for the last year and a half has not been doing this. So we no longer even live in a democracy. And someone retorted, well, they were democratically elected. I was like, good, that's typically how a lot of other tyrannical regimes got started. They get democratically elected and then abuse of emergency orders in order to rule without democracy. And when you have François Legault in Quebec saying, I don't want a public debate on the vaccine passports because it will expose the population to misinformation, it's no longer a democracy officially.
Now you're talking freedom of speech, and now you're talking Bill C-10, Bill C-36.
Oh, yeah.
You're talking about the reinitiation of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Code. You're talking about all these measures that are being floated now and are coming back into being to shut down any possibility for you and me to have this Zoom conversation. That is what's happening.
This is it's good. It's after an hour now. It's come full circle. It can be understood backwards, but has to be lived forwards. And now, potentially one can think that there is a strategy. Don't call it a conspiracy, a strategy to think, okay, we're going to implement all these measures. We're going to rule by fiat for a year and a half. And when people start getting upset, well, let's talk about regulating the internet. Let's talk about imposing broadcast standards on individual YouTube channels. Let's talk about, enhancing what hate speech is, because at some point, damn well they're going to say saying F you to the prime minister is hate speech. Lock them up, criminalize it, so that there is no form of meaningful protest anymore. And one can either put things together. It could say it's part of design or it's just part of incompetence. The outcome is the same. It is the disintegration of whatever was a free and democratic society. Some people say Canada never was one. It was, I don't know what they say, a post-nation state. We were always subjects to the crown. I thought it was a free country, and if I'm wrong, so be it. But if I was right, I'm gonna do everything I can to make it a free country again.
Yeah, I thought it was a free country, and I thought it was so when I stepped forward to in 1991 to fly F-18s over the Middle East. But yeah, we have gone full circle. This has been one heck of a conversation, David. It's been
great. I mean,
I got to tell you, to be fair, I'm going to I want to be balanced, so I'll give you fair warning that I've invited Marc Garneau to come on to In Hot and have a chat. He hasn't answered. He hasn't got back to me yet, though.
No, but I am. It's fantastic. I am not only, for my own free speech. I am for the free speech of others, even those who say terrible things about me. Because first of all, no one will ever be able to compare if they don't hear both sides. And it's, when I do these things, I don't ask for questions in advance. I don't limit the conversation. There's nothing off limits. It is the way things have to be done. And if they refuse, it's telling of something. So I love it. It's not fair warning. Do it. Everyone should expose their ideas to the public so that people can see who they're voting for and see what they actually truly believe or what they truly want to implement. And they'll make a very enlightened decision afterwards.
I tell you what, before we go, David, is there anything our listeners, we have, by the way, about 40,000 folks who belong to C3RF. They're across the country. We have a good number in Montreal, as a matter of fact. That's where I got the buzz about you, was from C3RF members in Montreal. But is there anything that the audience could do to help, or any place they can go, or any final remarks?
To help with to help with the campaign, vivappc.ca is my electoral district campaign website. People's Party of Canada has the website as well. You can donate to either. I believe we will be able to issue tax receipts in the future. We haven't been accredited by the Elections Canada yet for our EDA, but so that we may not be able to issue tax receipts. So if you want to contribute to the campaign, that's where you can do it. We don't have issues monetarily, but you know, the PPC at large will always be happy to receive donations. Advertising is very important because the media doesn't cover it. But I sort of, it's not a cliche. The most important thing anybody can do is just talk to friends and neighbors. I say from a personal my own interest perspective, talk about the PPC and let everybody out there know that the PPC are not anti-vaxxers, anti-climate, anti-science radicals. They are, there's a world of difference between being anti-vaccine passport and anti-vaccine, and we are anti-vaccine passport. I'm vaccinated. Maxime has publicly said he's not. We respect each other's decisions and think that they are personal decisions. Yes. We are not anti-science, and we're not anti-environment. There is a world of difference between being anti-carbon tax and anti-Paris Accord and anti-environment. And my argument is that carbon tax and Paris Accord will only exacerbate whatever they believe the problem to be and not solve it, while crippling the Canadian economy and punishing Canadians. So world of difference there as well. But talk about the party, talk about politics, get people to actually be informed. They may not vote for the PPC. They may say, I am pro-vaccine passport, but at the very least, they should know, not the truth, but they should have, they should know the truth. It's a cliche. They should know what they're voting for and not be voting based on exaggerated, demonized perspectives of a political party that has been radically demonized and misrepresented by a liberal federal government funded government.
Yeah, I also note that the PPC have a extensive platform up on their website there.
Everything's there. I mean, everything's there, and you'll read it. It's
really really comprehensive. Yeah,
and it's common sense. Smaller government, tighter immigration, take care of Canadians first, which is all Canadians, not just white ethnic Canadians. I mean, they call the party racist because they say Canada first, as if Canada is an ethnically homogeneous country. Yep. We have serious problems that affect every demographic in Canada. But every policy is up there. As far as I'm concerned, it's common sense, logic policies, even on the most divisive of issues, personal, individual choice on issues of conscience, smaller government, responsible government, and above all else, ethical and uncorrupt. Because what we've been dealing with and what we've been witnessing, whether you're a liberal or not, even the liberals that I talk to recognize that the liberal government has been, at least since 2015, unethical and fundamentally corrupt. The only question is, can they stomach voting for somebody else? And I say, at some point you're going to have to, because it's only going to get worse if you continue voting these people back into power.
Yeah, it is time for some disruption, I think, is really what we need in our political scene these days. For other folks who aren't members of C3RF, if you want to take a look at what we have to say, we're at www.canadiancitizens.org. Citizens is plural. Take a look there and join the conversation there. And I think I agree with you totally, David. There really, people have to start standing up, talking, get around the water cooler and start talking about the issues of the day. And don't be intimidated if your opinion is a little bit different from someone else's. It's freedom of speech. So with that, David, thanks so much. This has been a tremendous, entertaining and interesting conversation.
Thank you very much for the invite.
Okay. Good day to you.
Have a good day.